So it would appear our vision for the best small island health and care system delivering longer, healthier lives, quote unquote, is somewhat similar to Wigan's 2014 vision for the future of integrated care. You said, if you don't mind me reading it, on Twitter, this is absolutely disgraceful, clearly highlights real problems with the culture and management at DHSC, which are getting harder and harder to pretend don't exist. Was there any political oversight of the development of this strategy? Will anyone stand up and take responsibility? Minister Ashford has stood up and taken responsibility, I suppose, and from what I can gather, there was political oversight of the development of the vision. What do you make of his comments, first of all?
Quite unusual, actually. The Public Accounts Committee did ask very specifically whether or not politicians in the department knew that the document that's been presented as an Isle of Man vision was more than 50%, apparently, lifted word for word from the Wigan strategy. The response after some moments of what I can only imagine were very uncomfortable silence in that room, the response was that the politicians had seen both documents, but there was no confirmation that yes, they definitely knew this was the case. And then obviously the ministers come out and said no, he was fully aware that this was very similar in a lot of ways to the Wigan document. So there's a bit of a contradiction there, which I'd hope the Public Accounts Committee themselves would pick up and look at. Personally, I'm not convinced by that. To be fair, the document itself and the way that this has come out doesn't really bode well for the openness and transparency of that department. It doesn't make me feel that they are really on the ball at all.
To quote from the, it's pretty standard kind of spiel at the bottom of the document. It says, all rights reserved, no part of this publication may be reproduced or transmitted in any form by any means, etc., without prior permission in writing from Michaela Morris. But I mean, Minister Ashford argues this isn't plagiarism, but do you agree with that?
I'd say that they're quite lucky that the Wigan document didn't have the same disclaimer on the bottom. I mean, when you're writing a thesis, a paper, an essay, a piece of schoolwork, a strategy, whatever it is, you're obviously going to draw from a wide range of sources, but the correct thing to do is to identify which parts of your document are coming from those sources, and if you're quoting from those sources, to make that abundantly clear. What's happened in this case is that hasn't happened. There is a small acknowledgement, I think, on the back page, that thank you very much to Wigan Council.
Yes, it says with special thanks, but that doesn't imply that the document has been borrowed. My real concern with this document, especially with the minister's comments this morning, he was talking about people just misunderstanding, and actually the examples in there are only examples. The bits that are specifically quoted as being from Manx people are genuinely from Manx people. This is the bit that I think I referenced as case studies, which aren't case studies as such, but representative examples given.
Yeah, and I think the minister's probably right there that the representative examples are just examples. The case studies he claims are fully Manx. My concern with that is there is a page in the document which I'll read to you now. It's near the start. It says, "We listen to what people would like to see from their health and care service," and then it goes on to say, "This is feedback from the focus groups held in 2017 in the south and west of the island." And then there are 5 statements beneath that. The problem is those 5 statements did not come from the working groups in the south and west of the island. Those 5 statements were lifted word for word from the Wigan strategy. And so if at one point they're saying this is real, genuine, honest feedback from Manx people, but then they're pasting in comments from the Wigan document, how much reliance can we have when the minister says, well, those Manx statements aren't real, but the other ones are, I promise. I'm not sold.
The minister also says this kind of practice is relatively common. Does that sort of inspire faith in the work undertaken behind the scenes?
It doesn't. I would challenge that. I would say that utilising bits from other places definitely is common. You take the best bits, the bits that you want to keep, but to lift word for word more than half of a vision, strategy, whatever you want to call it, I would suggest that is not relatively common. And from my own experience, I've never worked in an organisation where any member of staff would have felt that doing that would have been appropriate, to just copy and paste a massive chunk and say this is my work. That I've never worked anywhere that would be considered acceptable. And so it makes me really question the management culture, the leadership culture in that department, where a member of staff or several members of staff, I don't know who has actually written this piece, have felt that it would be acceptable to do that, especially at such a high level, especially with a document that is essentially, it's gone before one of our Tynwald Select Committees.
Well, about half an hour before the Speaker of the House of Keys, Stuart Watterson, kind of revealed his findings about the similarities, they asked Mrs. Michaela Morris who the author was. She said it was her. She did give some reference to some sort of third-party input, I think, and some other contributors. But at that point, anyway, she had said she was the author of the document.
Yeah, I asked a question in December of last year about the integrated care strategy, because one of the actions in the programme for government is to develop and implement this strategy. So it was concerning, firstly, that the answer I got back referenced this document as if it were the strategy document, and we've heard the Minister already say, no, this isn't a strategy, this is a vision. So there's been a bit of inconsistency there. Is it strategy or is it not? Because at one point, a month ago, they were claiming this was the strategy document, and now they're kind of saying it isn't. But in response to that question, the Minister stated this document was largely informed by 14 engagement sessions held with key stakeholders in May 2018. It turns out, actually, the document was largely informed by copying and pasting from the Wigan document. And so really, I think what you've just said about behind the scenes, that's where I have my real concerns, is how much work has gone into this, how much understanding is there. I mean, if I'm just going to copy and paste from somewhere else, do I really understand what I've just copied and pasted or not? Whereas at least if I've read it, I've interpreted it, I've applied the best bits, it shows that I do understand what I'm writing, what I'm talking about, which is why plagiarism is such a big deal in academic and educational circles. You don't just copy and paste because it doesn't prove anything. So really, I think you're right. What is going on behind the scenes? What is the controls over this process? How robust is their review process in the department? If this has managed to go from someone's desk right the way through the politicians, right the way through to approval, and actually no one's noticed, or if they have noticed, they've been okay with it.
I'm led to believe as well that the 5-year oral health strategy, which was from 2011 to 2016, may also have been largely borrowing from a previous document in Salford. So I don't want to cast aspersions, but if this is something which is more common practice than perhaps we realise, is that a concern, or is that something which you think is or should be common? But I don't know. What are your views on that?
I think, like I've already said, I think it's perfectly acceptable to pick the best bits of someone else's strategy and say, this is good, we're going to apply this to our island. They did that with the road safety strategy, for example. They've taken international best practice and they've said, we're going to apply this to the island. And that's absolutely fine. But what you shouldn't be doing is taking someone else's piece of work and then passing it off as if it was a purely independent, original researched idea, which is kind of how this comes across. It comes across as being, this is ours, that we've developed ourselves. All the references to how it was developed have been, well, we've worked with stakeholders on the Isle of Man, we've had focus groups on the Isle of Man, and then they've printed outputs from those focus groups that actually haven't come from those focus groups. They've come from Wigan.
Minister Ashford says there's been no attempt made to hide the fact that it was borrowed from Wigan.
I'm not sure about that. And like I say, if you look back at the answer that I got in December, no reference at all in that to a Wigan document. Nowhere did they say, actually, yes, we've taken it, almost half of the document, or over half the document, from somewhere else. And whilst they may not have deliberately gone out of their way to hide it, it's never been mentioned. It's never been highlighted before, as far as I'm aware, that this is where they've got the document from. The reference has always been to those local stakeholder groups working with the community to develop a strategy that suits the Isle of Man. That's always been the message, the language we're hearing. And now all of a sudden we find out that might not be the whole story. And so whilst I obviously can't dispute with the Minister that he says he's never tried to hide it, that I can accept that statement, but equally they've never been entirely honest about where it's come from. I think is probably the best way I'd phrase it.
Minister Ashford was keen to distinguish between the integrated care strategy and integrated care vision, which is this document specifically. Is it hoped that this will be sort of up for discussion on the floor of Tynwald, I suppose? What comes next?
Well, I think it's up to the Public Accounts Committee to drive this forward. They've obviously highlighted the issue, and they're the right place to highlight this, to bring it up, to delve deeper into, is this a one-off? Is this a widespread practice within health? What is the problem? If there is a problem, it's up to the Public Accounts Committee to challenge that. I would dispute with the Minister where he says this is only a vision document, because, like I say, I've asked questions specifically about the strategy, and in response to those questions, it has always been, here's the document. They've referred to it as a vision, but it's always been, when I asked about the strategy, here's the document. And so to now start trying to distinguish between the two, it kind of makes me think, well, when you're answering those questions a month ago, surely you should have said, we don't have a strategy yet, all we've got is a vision. And that, so far, it hasn't happened. So I'm a little bit concerned, really, about the way that this has been approached by the department.
I asked the Minister how much the document costed to produce, and he, to paraphrase, said it costed next to nothing or relatively little. I suppose perhaps that's an argument in favour of borrowing from other jurisdictions, is you can get it for a cut price, perhaps.
That is, of course, assuming that they did pay for it at all. I suppose that's a question best directed at Wigan, as whether or not they gave permission for the Isle of Man Department for Health and Social Care to lift, word for word, their strategy. And again, there's nothing wrong with borrowing from somewhere else. There's nothing wrong with taking the best bits, but to use exactly the same wording, exactly the same quotes and comments and references, and try and pretend, and the document does very heavily imply, in fact it states it outright, that some of these statements are outputs from workshops they've held on the Isle of Man, and that clearly isn't the case, unless people on the Isle of Man happen to make exactly the same word-for-word comments that people in Wigan have made, which is possible, I'll admit, but I would suggest highly unlikely.